Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. We mentioned in our previous lecture that the educational system, such as it was in archaic Greece, was heavily influenced by the values that can be found in the Homeric poems, the Iliad, and to some degree in the Odyssey. These, of course, are aristocratic worldviews that are presented in these poems. They are one received an education wherein one was trained to be a speaker of words and a doer of deeds. That is, to be a great man of action on the battlefield, where physical prowess and courage were idealized. And one was expected to be able to communicate somewhat effectively in council and, of course, in one's interactions. So there is this kind of dual physical and intellectual or kind of literary quality that can be found even within the Homeric poems. And as time went on in the Archaic period and the development of the polis system, this is essentially the kind of education that one saw. So this old education, as it is referred to by Henri Moreau in his great work on classical Greek education, education in antiquity, it is characterized by these twin aspects. That is, the intellectual on the one hand and the physical on the other hand, or what in Greek were known as the gymnastike and the musike. Gymnastike obviously refers to the gymnastic part, coming from gymnos, meaning naked in Greek, because one exercised heroically nude. And musike coming from the word for muse, actually. The musical education, in this sense, wasn't just musical, it was also literary. In fact, it was primarily literary, but one was expected to learn how to play the lyre, for instance, and be able to recite poetry. Gymnastic education was very much influenced by military ideals, the ideals of strength, stamina, preparation for war. Having a physically fit body was looked at as being a major aspect of the Greek ideal for education. In fact, our word calisthenics is ultimately a ancient Greek word, kalos meaning beauty, and stenos meaning strength. And so calisthenics literally means beautiful strength. Boys would typically begin their physical education either during or just after beginning their elementary literary education. So these two things went hand in hand. Initially, boys would learn from a private teacher known as a paidotribe, that is some kind of like coach or something like that. And one would begin with all the typical kind of ancient sports that we associate with ancient Greece: wrestling, discus throwing, even boxing, javelin throwing, running, those kind of things. So you see there's a kind of martial aspect to them all. Even on this ancient vase that you see depicted in front of you, the paidotribai would stand by this beside their charges and urge them on, tell them what to do. And it's interesting, this what is known as black figure in this vase, it's an earlier form of vase painting that one associates particularly with Corinth, but Athens also had black figure vases. And it was obviously very difficult for them to depict children. You can see that in this and in many other examples that the children wind up looking just kind of like smaller versions of old men. The details and the kind of characteristics of the face and stuff of the child would only be worked out later on, much later on. Anyway, physical training was seen as necessary for improving one's appearance, but also, of course, for preparing for war, which would have been a day, if not a daily event in the life of a polis of ancient Greece, certainly a yearly event every springtime or so. Typically, these different polis, these different city-states, would beat up on their neighbors, have territorial disputes of one kind or another that were settled in a way that has proven so popular throughout history, going to war. And this, of course, would be somehow tied in with the civic duties of a person inside of a polis. On the other hand, though, the musical education involved, of course, music in our sense of the word, but also dancing, the memorization of lyric poetry, and also, very importantly, Homer. Okay, Homer is always going to be the bedrock of the literary education of ancient Greece, and right on up into the Roman period, into the Byzantine period, And it's essentially only in the modern age, that is in the 20th century, that students have begun to neglect the reading of Homer. It would have been inconceivable for anyone educated in the West for the last 2,500 years, if not longer, to consider themselves educated without a knowledge, deep knowledge of the Iliad and the Odyssey. And musical education in the broad Greek sense obviously imparted not only literary culture and sense of beauty and language and so on, but also certain moral ideals, the ideals of nobility, of heroic behavior, an appreciation for harmony and rhythm and these kind of things that could be communicated through musical education. Students would, of course, learn how to read and write based on these literary models. They would write inside of waxen tablets that would be etched with a stylus. And primarily, as I keep repeating, poetry is really the main thing. Prose is really not that big of a subject at this time in the archaic period. It will become much more important as time goes on, but initially, really for this early period, it's and right on up until the 5th century, it's primarily poetry, memorization, and the writing of poetry down, and any kind of grammatical education that took place would be based on poetic texts. Okay, and these texts, of course, are the mythology of Greece, of Homer and Hesiod, where one would learn about the gods and man's place in the universe. One would learn morality from the tales of the ancient Greeks, where hubris and how hubris can be a destructive force is portrayed in some of these myths. And of course, it was totally connected with the religious worldview of the ancient Greeks. The very concept of how one is to interact with the gods is put forward from the very first pages of Homer's Iliad and on all the rest of these texts. I'm thinking particularly about the opening scene of the Iliad, where a father named Chryses, who was a priest of Apollo, a Trojan, goes to the Greeks who are encamped down by the shore outside of Troy. And he goes to Agamemnon, the leader of the Greeks, because he wants to get his daughter back, who has been taken captive by the Greeks. And he comes down and says, "Oh, Agamemnon, may the gods give it to you to sack Troy and to make it home safely. I pray for your success. Just please give me back my daughter." And Agamemnon treats him very haughtily and says, "You better, if you know what's good for you, you'll get away and you'll never come back around here. Your daughter is coming back home to me in Greece, and she will tend my loom and my bed." And he sends him away very arrogantly. And the man stands off to the side, wandering down the long, resounding beach, weeping as he walks. And he raises his hands up and prays to Apollo and says, "O Smintheus," which is a cultic name for you have to address the gods by just the right name and particular locations. They're very tied to locations. There is Apollos of different places. This is Apollo Smintheus, Lord of the Silver Bow. He says, "If ever I have pleased you with the sacrifices of the thighs of rams or of goats, or if ever I have hatched over a roof above your altar, then hear my prayer now and pay back the Greeks with your arrows for my tears." And the prayer goes up, and Apollo hears it, and he is angered at heart. And the god comes down like night upon the Achaeans, the Greeks, and his arrows rattle mightily upon his shoulder. And he lets loose an arrow inside of the Greek host. And of course, what this means is he's spreading a disease. And he spreads it, and the men start to get sick. First, the animals, the dogs and the mules begin to get sick, and then the men do. And then very succinctly, the poet just says, "And the funeral pyres burned into the night." Now, the reason why I'm recapping this whole episode for you is that this is a very particular worldview that is being communicated by such scenes. The place of gods and men, the relationship between those two, is very clearly shown in this case to be one of reciprocity, of contractual relationship that would later on be summed up so nicely in the Latin phrase do ut des, I give in order that you may give. You see, in fact, in Greek, the word to pray that is used in this, there are multiple words to pray, but one of the most common one, the one that is used in this scene, is the word euchomai. Okay, this is actually, it comes right over into modern Greek. The modern Greek word for prayer is prosephi, which comes directly from this euchomai. And if you look up in an ancient Greek dictionary what euchomai means, it actually means to boast, okay, to vaunt oneself. That's the primary meaning. And only secondarily does it come to mean to pray. And you probably are thinking, what on earth could the word to boast have to do with praying? Isn't that totally the opposite idea? And I would quickly add, hasten to say that you are thinking in Christian terms if you think that that is the total opposite thing. Obviously, in Christianity, the proper disposition of a person beseeching God is to be penitent and to think of one's own unworthiness. And I am unworthy, Lord, to be heard by you, but in your mercy, hear me. But not so in the Greek pagan worldview, wherein a person had to show what they had done for the God lately. What have you done for me lately? That old Joni Mitchell song. It's, if you didn't do something for the gods that it makes you worthy of being heard, then you're just barking up, you're talking to the wall. And so you need to vaunt yourself. You need to show, and that's exactly what the priest does. He says, if he reminds Apollo of all the nice things that he's done for him, I've given you, these various sacrifices, I've built shrines to your honor and so on, and therefore hear my prayer now. So it's very contractual. We're not talking about, nobody had a personal relationship with Zeus or Apollo or anything like that. It's all very kind of contractual. You want it to rain, you do the rain dance. You want it victory in battle, you do from the sacrifice of the animal. So anyway, this is how worldviews are communicated to young people through literary texts. And of course, in medieval times, in Christian culture, a different worldview would be communicated by different texts. Okay, and we're going to come to that later on when we look at the transition of classical texts into Christian societies and how early Christian church fathers would interpret these classical texts, because everybody liked Homer. But yet it teaches a very different kind of worldview. How do you transition from that kind? How do you use a text that teaches such a different worldview where than the one you want your young students to acquire? And we will. That's getting way ahead of ourselves. We will deal with that issue when the time comes, much later in our course. But the point, though, to understand is that mythopoetic legends, particularly those found in Homer and Hesiod, were so highly regarded by all the Greeks that their works were. They laid the foundation. They were in some ways the totality of the texts that were used in early education. The big point to understand is that old education lacked heavy structure, only featured schooling up to the elementary level. Once a child reached adolescence, his formal education would end, and therefore a large part of this education was informal and relied on simple human experience. In fact, one of the interesting things that about the Greek language is that the word for leisure time in ancient Greek is the word skole, where every single European language, including English, derives its word for school. Okay, every European language, some form or another, they use some form or another of that word to mean the word for school. Why would the word leisure time give us the word for school? Well, because of this Greek idea that you learn things not just in a classroom, but through life. It's kind of like what Mark Twain once said, I never let my schooling interfere with my education. Okay, so in one's leisure time, you attended poetry recitations. In one's leisure time, you attended oratory, where speakers would declaim on issues. You would go down to the law courts, you would listen to legal cases being argued, you would talk with people, discuss things. You learn a lot in your leisure time, and that is very much a big part of the Greek classical vision of education. It's not something that can ever truly be completed. You're constantly being enriched, and we should spend our free time. The Greek ideal is to spend one's free time enriching ourselves, not just to kind of say, okay, I go to school and then I just, hit the TikTok and I hit my video games and, or whatever the version of that is, at our point in society. The idea is not just simply to go to school and then leave that behind, but rather your free time should be meant being truly educative. Okay, now, so that sort of takes us down to the middle of the 5th century. And by that point, Athens had really outstripped any other polis in the ancient Greek world by the middle of the 5th century as one of the most intellectually lively societies that the world had ever seen. Having been instrumental in the spectacular and quite unanticipated triumph over a numerically vastly superior Persian army in the year 480 to 479, the city-state of Athens, over this next half century, the first part of the 5th century, that is, had built itself up into the political, economic, and cultural powerhouse of Greece. It employed fairly ruthless tactics to transform by easy stages an originally anti-Persian defensive league, known as the Delian League, into a straightforward maritime empire, largely by the device of commuting contributions of men and ships to the allied forces into a system of money payments, which became an imperial tribute. So the Greeks got together after 479 and said, look, we don't know if the Persians will come again. They had come already 10 years earlier in 490, and now they came now in 480 to 479. Who's to say they won't come again? Let's create something like a NATO, some kind of defensive alliance whereby if they ever do come again, we can protect ourselves. And so everybody agreed to that. Not everybody, but a lot of city-states, polis, agreed to that. And this became the Delian League. But over time, it became an Athenian empire. Ultimately, by 454 to 453, the treasury of the League was moved from the island of Delos and Athens, and Pericles, the great leader of Athens in the mid-century, 5th century BC, authorized the use of a portion of the monies accruing to the treasury for the beautification of the city of Athens itself, particularly in respect to the reconstruction of the buildings on the Acropolis, that is the great citadel, kind of huge rocky outcrop in the middle of Athens. And the most spectacular of these public buildings was the Parthenon. The word Parthenos in Greek means virgin, so the temple of the goddess Athena, one of the virgin goddesses of ancient Greece, and the patron deity of the city of Athens. That's right. Well, that's why Athens is called Athens. It's named after Athena. Incidentally, this same building has been reconstructed in all places in Nashville, Tennessee, and one can actually go and see what it would have been like with a recreation of the gold and ivory statue of Athena holding the winged god Victory, Nike, a word that has become immortalized in American footwear as Nike, in the palm of her hand. In the same period, that is mid-5th century, domestically, Athens became by stages, culminating in the reforms of Pericles and another man named Ephialtes around 458, an extreme participatory democracy, what might be called radical democracy, ruled by a sovereign assembly with a quorum of 6,000 male citizens, and in which every male citizen took direct part in the running of the state at various different times. This meant that people who were orators, people who were very powerful speakers who could speak in front of the assembly and were able to command the attention and allegiance of the common people, became extremely powerful, could become indeed demagogues, or that's the negative, they could become powerful statesmen, would be the positive way of saying it. And a situation thus arose in which the people were, as a whole, the demos, were officially all-powerful, and office holders were technically weak and transitory. That is, frequently they were selected by lot and they never got longer than a year in office. And then at the end of that year, there would be a public scrutiny by the ecclesia, by the assembly, before leaving office, and sometimes right after office. And this was called the euthune, the public scrutiny of their time in office. And if they were found to be at all negligent or worse, corrupt in the execution of their duties, they could be banished. They could be exiled from the city. In fact, a prosperous and sometimes extremely rich elite also flourished during this time and managed to extend its influence from the social and economic spheres into the political sphere, while at the same time remaining vulnerable to vexatious lawsuits directed at its members through the popular courts and the euthune. What I'm getting at here is that there came to be placed a premium on public speaking, because if one were well off and aspired to a public career, or even to hold one's own in a private lawsuit, or to defend oneself in the scrutiny that came at the end of one's year in office, one had to acquire a facility in public speaking. And because it was a democracy, this meant that any person, really, rich or poor, if they could master the arts of public speaking, then they could really have a very powerful career ahead of them. Athens, we must remember, never developed any system of higher education. Indeed, little more than what we would regard as I said, primary education, ending about the age of 14 or so, was ever the norm. And even that was always privately funded. So that as a demand arose for further training in the arts of thinking and speaking, a gap in the market manifested itself that cried out to be filled. They needed people who were willing, who were able to fill that gap with a higher linguistic and literary and rhetorical education, and filled it. They duly did. It was filled by a remarkable series of individuals coming from various parts of the Greek world, but converging on Athens like flies to a honeypot. And these are the individuals whom we collectively term the Sophists. Now, the word Sophistes, which seems first to have gained currency early in the 5th century BC, was originally, with a favorable or at least neutral connotation, something like our word expert or even pundit, one who was skilled or wise, the word for which is sophos in Greek. So a sophistes is one who was wise in a particular art or craft. The natural suspicion of the man in the street for experts in any particular arcane discipline, or for intellectuals in general, no doubt helped to give the word also a derogatory sense. But it was not until the latter part of the century, when Athens became the venue for this kind of traveling expert, quote unquote, in the arts of discourse and persuasion, that it acquired the particularly hostile overtones that are manifest in Plato's dialogues. And it is from those dialogues, really, and the negative perceptions about the sophists, that our word in English, sophist, takes its negative connotations, right? When you call somebody a sophist in English, it means that you're insulting that person. That's a negative term. It means you're talking about somebody who uses logic in an abusive way, who abuses words and rhetoric and tries to kind of throw dust in the eyes of his listeners, tries to confuse them and get them to believe something that's not true. Fancy lines, basically. Already in 423 BC, however, the comic poet Aristophanes, in his play The Clouds, can assume this sense of the word to be perfectly familiar to his audience, because he uses it to lampoon Plato's own hero, Socrates, whom he employs rather unscrupulously as a representative sophist. But this time, I should say, by this time, in fact, all the major figures in the movement that we called the sophistic movement had already made their appearance in Athens. It would be misleading, however, to suggest that Athens was the only arena in which these sophists plied their trade. The great cities of Sicily and southern Italy, in particular, were also avid customers. Remember, that is part of what the Romans would later call Magna Graecia, larger Greece. And the chief sophists, so far as we could observe, were continually on tour. But it is certainly the case that Athens was the venue of choice in the second half of the 5th century. Such men as Protagoras from Abdera on the coast of Thrace, Protagoras from the small Aegean island of Chios, Gorgias from the city of Leontini in Sicily, and Hippias from Elis, which is in the western part of mainland Greece, in the western Peloponnesus, an area not otherwise noted for its intellectual interests or achievements, all converged on Athens in approximately the chronological order of what I've just laid out, from the early 450s onwards, in order to give public lectures, and more importantly, in order to give private instruction to those who were willing and able to pay the price, which by all accounts was enormous. This was definitely a luxury education for the chosen few, and in consequence, it attracted consistently unfavorable attention from the common people and their champions. Though the great statesman Pericles, it must be said, a popular leader though he was on friendly terms with Protagoras, at least, as he was also with the philosopher Anaxagoras. The Sophists also, as we learn from the writings of Plato in the next generation, provoked the opposition of that remarkable figure, Socrates, a native of Athens, who, while himself appeared to the vulgar eye as part of the movement, I've already just mentioned how Aristophanes kind of lampooned him in his play The Clouds. Nevertheless, Socrates challenged the basic suppositions of Protagoras in particular, in ways that were to have, through Plato, momentous consequences for the subsequent reputation of the Sophists and for the course of European philosophy as a whole. We learn, for instance, from the pages of Plato, a certain amount of the conditions under which the great Sophists operated when they came to visit Athens. It would be normal for them, it seems, to stay with one or other prominent member of society who was a patron of the new learning. Such was the character Callias, who is mentioned in the Gorgias dialogue of Plato, and who was said to be the son of one Hipponicus. And also it was at his house that Protagoras stayed when Socrates went to visit him. At the request of a young protege, Hippocrates, who wants to be introduced to the great man. Well, at this gathering, which we read about in Plato's dialogue, the Protagoras, we also find another prominent sophist, Hippias, and yet another, Protagoras, who will have been in town at the same time, and quite a scattering of prominent Athenians, including the two sons of Pericles and the notorious kind of bête noire of Athenian politics at this time, Alcibiades. Protagoras has with one of his pupils, Antimonus of Mende, a small town on the Chalcidian Peninsula, who plainly traveled around with him. And then again, as I said, in the Gorgias, we find the sophist Gorgias, accompanied by his chief pupil Polus, established in the house of the prominent aristocrat Callicles. I mistakenly said it was Callias before. Callias is from the Protagoras. Callicles is in the Gorgias. And this character, it is thought actually by scholars may not actually reflect a historical person. But the idea, though, is that in the dialogue, he expresses strong views of a sophistic nature. And he might have just been kind of a mouthpiece for that position, is what is thought. But in other Platonic dialogues, such as the Lesser Hippias, Socrates meets Hippias, a sophist, in the house of Eutychus, son of Epaminondas, where he has been giving a display speech. And from the greater Hippias, another Platonic dialogue, we learn that he is about to give a public lecture at Eutychus's request in the school of Philostratus. Thrasymachus of Chalcedon, another sophist too, one of the second-rank sophists, we might say, we find similarly ensconced in the house of the preposterous resident alien Cephalus in the Piraeus, when Socrates comes to visit in the Republic. As for the preposterous sophistical brothers, Euthydemus and Dionysiodorus, who hail originally from Chios, Socrates comes upon them in the Euthydemus, in the Lyceum Gymnasium, surrounded by a crowd of followers, but they were doubtless staying with some patron too. All of this, of course, are literary constructions that Plato makes, fictions in a sense, but we have no reason to doubt the essential accuracy of the background situations From such comfortable bases, the great sophists could move out to give public discourses in schools or gymnasiums around the city, or if they were in town on public business, they as ambassadors, for instance, from their respective cities. We know that Gorgias did exactly this on occasion. The first occasion when he appeared in Athens in 427, he was an ambassador from his city of Leontini. He came to address the ecclesia or the boule, the assembly or the council. We know that Protagoras also did such things. The fees quoted for a full course from Protagoras or Gorgias were 100 minae. And now, just to give you an idea of how much that is, 300 minae would probably be the salary of a skilled laborer for about 8.5 years. Okay, so 100 minae, you're talking about maybe a 2-year salary for a skilled worker. So whatever that is in modern day American money, well over $100,000, I'm sure. That sum seems unbelievable, but it is what is given, and we do have various testimonies to such sums, as we'll see in a moment. Socrates himself testifies, ironically, to having taken the 1 drachma course in etymology from Protagoras, rather than his 50 drachma course. This is in the Platonic dialogue known as the Cratylus, in section which is dated to around 384 BC. And which means that he is not really competent in the subject. The 1 drachma course can only have been a sort of trailer for the real thing. So the main sophists made an excellent living. That's the point to make, not only in Athens, but in many ways other parts of Greece as well, the Greek world. Socrates in the Greater Hippias actually speaks of Protagoras, while in Athens on an embassy from his native Chios, as earning an incredible amount of money from giving lectures as a private individual and meeting with our young men, is the way he puts it. Far more than he would a practitioner of any other craft. This makes a lot more money than any other craft. And to this, the boastful Hippias says the following: "Why, Socrates, you know nothing of the beauties of this. For if you were to know how much money I have made, you would be amazed. I won't mention the rest, but once when I went to Sicily, although Protagoras was staying there and had a great reputation and was the elder, I, who was much younger, made in a very short time more than 150 minas, and in one very small place, Inachus, more than 20 minas. And when I came home, I took this and gave it to my father, so that he and the other citizens were overwhelmed with amazement. Now I pretty well think I have made more money than any other 2 sophists together." So the pickings were rich. If you had the right stuff to impart, you could attract a big following. Now, what I would like us to do is to consider what were some of the chief elements of the sophist teaching by taking a look at just some of the most famous of them, the ones that I've kind of outlined already. The most notable and pervasive feature, the sophists were not a unified school. It's very important to understand. You can kind of get that even from this quote I just read. They were actually competitors with one another in much the same way that colleges compete to get students, because they wanted to make money. And so they're not a unified school of thought, but yet nevertheless, there are certain themes that keep coming up again and again inside of their teaching and inside of those who were influenced by them, that we can in some ways talk about them as a single group. And as I was about to say, the most notable and pervasive concept, perhaps, that one sees throughout this group is a strong contrast that is set up between what we might call nature on the one hand and convention on the other hand. The Greek words for this are nomos on the one hand and physis on the other hand. Such a contrast is not indeed first set up by the sophists. We find instances of it that antedate this. One finds it, for instance, even in the poets Pindar or Sophocles in his Antigone, which was composed around 440 BC. But nevertheless, this nomos physis antithesis in its developed form is certainly characteristic of the sophistic movement. In fact, once one has set up such a contrast between what is cultural on the one hand and what is natural on the other hand, once one has set up such a contrast, one can take different attitudes toward it. One attitude, which is represented notably by Protagoras, is the idea that nature may well be more fundamental, but custom, law, even nomos, there's different translations for that word, is a modification of nature that is necessary to the development and preservation of civilized society. And so nomos is to be preferred. Of course, the alternative position adopted later by Nietzsche, the German philosopher, that nature must be preferred to law or convention, and that it dictates unlimited self-aggrandizement and domination on the part of the stronger over the weaker. That is represented most starkly in Plato's works, particularly by the Athenian aristocrat Callicles, who may or may not be a real person, just to repeat, in the Gorgias dialogue. And of course, by the character Thrasymachus, and this may or may not be a real representation of the real Thrasymachus, but that can be found in Book 1 of the Republic by Plato, as well as in something that we will be reading about later on today, today, that is the Athenian negotiating team in Thucydides' Melian dialogue in Book 5 of his Histories, where they basically put forward a very bald and brutal form of might makes right. Okay, but it can be found in all of these, that the idea that nature is by itself nasty, brutish, and short, and therefore we can act like that because that's the state of nature. Probably no responsible sophist argued such a position in its fullness, at least in public, but it is certainly a conclusion that could be and doubtlessly was drawn by some of their more unscrupulous followers. A peculiarity of this position is that the natural state of man is conceived, for the purpose of the argument, to be one of absolute individualism, a war of all against all, whereas it is just as plausible to argue that man is naturally a gregarious animal, right? That man is not like a mountain goat that lives by itself by nature, but is social, as Aristotle would say, ho anthropos estin politikons zoon. Man is a political animal, that is a creature who lives in a political community. And therefore, a considerable degree of social cooperation and compromise is intrinsic to human nature. You could draw that conclusion too from this. And such indeed is the message to be derived in the first work we're going to take a look at tonight. And that is the so-called great speech of the Homegos Logos of Protagoras, as put forward in Plato's dialogue, the Protagoras. Let's read this together, keeping in mind the notion that for Protagoras, human beings by nature are weak and sort of, kind of the prey of the natural world. And therefore, it is logos, it is reason and the faculty of speech that give mankind an advantage, and that can only reach its full flourishing in the political community. Okay, this is a very common idea that is found inside of Greek thought, that man can only really find its full flourishing in a political community, and the art of speech is and persuasion is very much a part of that. Let's read it together. And as I said, Protagoras sets this up as a kind of myth, but it's to prove or illustrate his philosophical point. Once upon a time, there were gods only, and no mortal creatures. But when the time came that these also should be created, the gods fashioned them out of earth and fire, and various mixtures of both elements in the interior of the earth. And when they were about to bring them into the light of day, they ordered Prometheus and Epimetheus to equip them, and to distribute to them severally their proper qualities. Epimetheus said to Prometheus, "Let me distribute, and do you inspect." This was agreed, and Epimetheus made the distribution. There were some to whom he gave strength without swiftness, while he equipped the weaker with swiftness. Some he armed, and others he left unarmed, and devised for the latter some other means of preservation, making some large, and having their size as a protection. and others small, whose nature was to fly in the air or burrow in the ground. This was to be their way of escape. Thus did he compensate them with the view of preventing any race from becoming extinct. And when he had provided against their destruction by one another, he contrived also a means of protecting them against the seasons of heaven, clothing them with close hair and thick skins sufficient to defend them against the winter cold and able to resist the summer heat, so that they might have a natural bed of their own when they wanted to rest. Also, he furnished them with hooves and hair and hard and callous skins under their feet. Then he gave them varieties of food herb of the soil, to some, to others fruits of trees, and to others roots, and to some again he gave other animals as food. And some he made to have few young ones, while those who were their prey were very prolific, and in this manner the race was preserved. Thus did Epimetheus, who not being very wise, forgot that he had distributed among the brute animals all the qualities which he had to give. And when he came to man, who was still unprovided, he was terribly perplexed. Now, while he was in this perplexity, Prometheus came to inspect the distribution, and he found that the other animals were suitably furnished, but that man alone was naked and shoeless, and had neither bed nor arms of defense. The appointed hour was approaching when man, in his turn, was to go forth into the light of day. And Prometheus, not knowing how he could devise his salvation, stole the mechanical arts of Hephaestus and Athena, and fire with them. They could neither have been acquired nor used without fire. And he gave them to man. Thus man had the wisdom necessary to the support of life, but political wisdom he had not, for that was in the keeping of Zeus. And the power of Prometheus did not extend to entering into the citadel of heaven, where Zeus dwelt, who moreover had terrible sentinels. But he did enter by stealth into the common workshop of Athena and Hephaestus, in which they used to practice their favorite arts, and carried off Hephaestus's art of working by fire, and also the art of Athena, and gave them to man. And in this way man was supplied with the means of life, where Prometheus is said to have been afterwards prosecuted for theft, owing to the blunder of Epimetheus. Now man, having a share of the divine attributes, was at first the only one of the animals who had any gods, because he alone was of their kindred, and he would raise altars and images of them. He was not long in inventing articulate speech and names, and he also constructed houses and clothes and shoes and beds, and drew sustenance from the earth. Thus provided, mankind at first lived dispersed, and there were no cities. But the consequence was that they were destroyed by the wild beasts, for they were utterly weak in comparison with them, and their art was only sufficient to provide them with the means of life, and did not enable them to carry on war against the animals. Food they had, but not as yet the art of government, of which the art of war is a part. And after a while, the desire of self-preservation gathered them into cities. But when they were gathered together, having no art of government, they evilly entreated one another, and were again in process of dispersion and destruction. Zeus, fearing that the entire race would be exterminated, and so he sent Hermes to them, bearing reverence and justice to be the ordering principles of cities and the bonds of friendship and reconciliation. Hermes asked Zeus how he should impart justice and reverence among men. Should he distribute them as the arts are distributed, that is to say, to a favored few only, one skilled individual having enough of medicine or of any other art for many unskilled ones? Shall this be the manner in which I am to distribute justice and reverence among men? Or shall I give them to all? To all, said Zeus. I should like them all to have a share, for cities cannot exist if a few only share in the virtues, as in the arts. And further, make a law by my order, that he who has no part in reverence and justice shall be put to death, for he is a plague of the state. So, my friends, what we see here is a very interesting notion that man is by nature weaker and more susceptible to death and being eaten, basically, than any other creature. Other creatures have scales and big, scary teeth and great strength, like a bear or a lion or something like that. Man is weak, and of course that is true. On the one hand, there is nothing more helpless than a human infant. Right? Other species, like a horse or an elephant or a sheep or something like that, the moment that it's born, within maybe 20 minutes, it's up on its feet, walking around. Okay, and it has to, otherwise it dies. Human beings are totally helpless. And if we don't have a group of people around us helping us, at least to some degree, some kind of community, then we don't survive. So that is one way of looking at nature and custom. And the thing that makes us able to dominate the natural world is our logos, is our faculty of speech, which of course is really an expression of our faculty of reason. Okay, so our reason is what makes us the kind of alphas of the universe, alphas of the earth, at least, in that we may not have great physical strength like a bear, but we have reason, which animals do not have. And therefore, our political life must be everybody has one. Everybody has some aspect of the logos in them. This is what Protagoras seems to be suggesting. And incidentally, he would actually he would state this very very emphatically in some other parts of his writings. Of course, nothing in full of his survives, but in some of the fragments that are quoted by later writers about him, he would talk about how every person has the capacity for learning to some degree, but you need three things. You can't just have natural ability. You need to have natural ability, that's 1/3. Then you need to have a good teacher, that's another third. And then the third one is, the third is you need to practice. You need to study on your own. So there must be natural ability, a good teacher, and there must be effort, okay, and study. And of course, that just makes so much sense. It is one of the things that, I oftentimes as a public school teacher, the big idea is basically that it's all the teacher's fault if the kids screw up. And this is not really, obviously there's something very illogical about that. Certainly if it's partially our responsibility, we make up 1/3 of it. But there must be some natural ability and there must be diligence and work on the student's part. And if you have these three things, then great things can happen. If you have a little bit of each one, then lesser great things can happen. Now, but again, the key point I'm trying to make, though, is that there is this nature versus culture divide, okay? That seems to be a preoccupation of all the Sophists. And this major antithesis can also be seen at the root of one of the most famous doctrines associated with the sophistic movement, which each sophist kind of deals with separately in his own way. And it is a doctrine that basically we might call moral relativism, okay? Protagoras states this most succinctly, most famously, in his phrase quoted by Plato in his Theaetetus: "Panton chrematon metron estin anthropos, ton menonton os estin, ton de uk onton hos uk estin." Man is the measure of all things. Of the things that are, that they are. Of the things that are not, that they are not. Now, this seems to be a pretty clear advancement of the idea of moral relativism. That is, that there is no such thing as good or bad in and of itself, but that all things are up to the human individual, okay, up to the subjective perspective, okay? In this regard, it has not been incorrectly stated that the Sophists were ancient pre-moderns, ancient postmoderns. That is, they were, like the postmodernists, that, Jordan Peterson spends so much time arguing against. The idea that there is no thing in and of itself that is good or bad, it's whatever your perspective is. So if you believe that something is good, then it's good for you. If you believe that justice is the might of the stronger, the might makes right kind of argument, then that's justice for you. If you believe, as Thrasymachus does in the first book of the Republic, that justice is when that if a tyrant throws his political opponents into jail and gives money and favors to his friends, and he calls that being just, well, then it is just. Okay, this is a very radical idea, but it's very common, of course, among many people, especially in modern day times. The answer to that, though, of course, and the reason why nobody really believes that deep down, is that we all have some intuitive sense of the moral law. We all somehow know that lying, betrayal, and infidelity, and all of these things, we all know somehow deep down that even if we do those things, that nevertheless that is a wrong thing. The moral law that every human society, every human individual somehow has an innate knowledge of, is always combined with the fact that we break that moral law all the time. We do lie, and we do do things that are wrong. And of course, on the other hand, too, nobody really believes in moral relativism, because everybody knows that there are certain things that are just absolutely wrong. Incest, cannibalism, slavery, genocide. Those things are always wrong, despite the fact that many people have at times in history justified them. This idea of man as the measure of all things certainly also has epistemological implications. How we know what we know. Protagoras apparently would say, well, he'd give the examples, well, the wind is cold for you, but it's not cold for me. This wine is sweet for me, but not for you. But Protagoras and disapprovingly Plato were primarily concerned with its ethical implications. Okay, Protagoras seems to have maintained that there was no such thing as objective right or wrong, simply conduct that was profitable or useful. Okay, chresimos is the Greek word there, and that which was not profitable, and he was of course there for a fee to teach what was not profitable, what was not useful, conduct, attitudes, tastes that were not useful. This certainly did not preclude their being also more socially beneficial, and indeed it would seem to have been Protagoras' position that they were necessarily so. He is far from being totally immoral, but he certainly would not, I think, agree that there is such thing as an objective good, that there is an objective just thing, certainly an objective beautiful thing. I don't think he would agree with any of that. All such concepts for Protagoras are based upon convention and compromise. And this is something that would also lead very much to his way that he would teach his students, because arising from the acceptance of this general principle that there is no such thing, no Ding an sich, as Kant would say, no thing in and of itself, one might raise questions about the naturalness of, say, the family, of private property, of the status of women, as I mentioned, slavery, or the distinction between Greeks and non-Greeks, whom the Greeks called barbaroi, barbarians, and about the very existence of the gods or the providential care for mankind. We do, in fact, have some evidence of the raising of all of these questions by the major Sophists or their followers during the latter part of the 5th century and the first half of the 4th century. Let's take that last one, for example, the existence of the gods. This is obviously a very sensitive question. And Protagoras, and with it combined, we might also add the origins of religion. Protagoras once famously said, "Concerning the gods, I am not in a position to know either that they exist or that they do not exist, for there are many obstacles in the way of such knowledge, notably the intrinsic obscurity of the subject and the shortness of human life." Protagoras clearly here is kind of setting an agenda. This is a very provocative sort of statement to make, and one can sort of discern by the flippancy of the way that this is worded, an idea that he really doesn't care. That he's it's as if he's kind of saying, yes, I really can't tell whether this is true or not, so I'm not going to worry about it. That's basically, I think, the implication of what he's saying here. It is like all statements of, if not outright atheism, then agnosticism, really a confession of lacking care, not really caring one way or another. This is the sort of thing, when there are certainly people who, and we will see this with Socrates and with Plato, people for whom the quest for truth is an all-consuming fire. And then there are others who really do not seem to care about those kind of things. And that's, I think, the attitude that is put forward by Protagoras in this. Protagoras, another sophist, for his part, has a very kind of radical idea about this, connected with this idea of Protagoras, and that is on the origin of religion. We read, for instance, in a work by the Epicurean poet Philodemus, writing many centuries later, that, quote, Protagoras was not unpersuasive in writing that things that provided nourishment or other help to us were the first things to be acknowledged and honored as gods, and later that persons who first found new means of obtaining food or providing shelter or invented other arts and crafts were called names like Demeter, Dionysius, and the like. And we read it in another reference by a philosopher named Sextus Empiricus, writing in the Roman period. Quote, Protagoras of Chios says that the ancients accounted as gods the sun and moon and rivers and springs, and in general all things that are of benefit for our life, because of the benefit derived from them, even as the Egyptians deified the Nile. And he says that it was for this reason that bread was worshipped as Demeter, and wine as Dionysius, and water as Poseidon, and fire as Hephaestus, and so on with each of the things that are good for use. So, in other words, do the gods exist? No. Okay, that is the basic idea. They were just human inventions, or not even that. They are divine, kind of divinized or deified appellations given to ordinary things that are beneficial. And of course, he's obviously looking back at the very close connection between things of the natural world and the pagan deities, Poseidon being the ocean somehow, and Aphrodite somehow being lust, and Zeus somehow being the sky, and so on. So this kind of anthropological or anthropomorphic deifying of things in the natural world. So there's clearly a kind of something of a radical critique of ancient Greek society at this time that one finds in these sophists. And one might very justly wonder, what effect does this moral outlook have on the education of young people? Because obviously this is something that, every educational system implies a moral outlook. In modern day times, we like to hear a lot about the difference between education and indoctrination, but this is in some ways a distinction without a difference, because definitely in the early years of one's education, it's just really indoctrination. The word doctrina in Latin simply means knowledge. So to indoctrinate someone in the strict sense really means to kind of just put knowledge into their heads. The idea of teaching one critical thinking, yes, that's all very good, but there's always going to be a worldview communicated to young people through the act of education. It's impossible to get away from that. So if you have this kind of quasi-atheistic moral relativism kind of coming across in education, how did that affect their actual teaching? Well, in some ways, this is actually the question, because it gets to the whole root of the sophistic enterprise. And it certainly would. It certainly did imply the kind of style of teaching that was taught. Remember, it was the whole instruction, the whole main thrust of the instruction offered by the sophists. And this would, whether it appeared to involve epistemology, etymology, physics, history, geography, or mathematics, it was in reality really all about rhetoric. Okay, it was about effective reasoning and the effective public speaking that would follow from that. And that is why the distinction set up by some authorities between sophistry and rhetoric, according to which a man like Gorgias, for example, is a teacher of rhetoric but not a sophist, seems a totally unreal one. All these men were in the business of creating effective public speakers. And that is what they were being paid large sums of money to do, not really just for the disseminating of knowledge for its own sake. And there are certainly, to that end, one of the techniques that was very often taught by these sophists is the idea that you could plead on both sides of a case, okay? Because there is no truth, you can argue for a case or you can argue against it. This, I should hasten to add, is standard pedagogy in law schools. Okay, you're taught to be able to, write a speech in defense of this man. Now write a speech against this man, saying that he's guilty. Now write a speech that he's innocent. Protagoras was famous for teaching that on any issue there were always two arguments opposed to one another. And according to Aristotle, Protagoras was criticized for boasting that he could, quote, make the weaker argument appear the stronger. Ton heto logon kreto poen. And that he could kind of wow the audience with a lot of fancy lies and verbiage, and be able to convince his audience that that something untrue was true, because for him, of course, there is no truth. And this one can see all over the place inside of, this is, of course, as I say, standard fare for modern day lawyers, but it's also to be found in the remaining documents that we have by them. They train their students to argue for what was not true, but what was possible. Okay, we should aim at what is possible. And, okay, I'm not saying that my client didn't do it. I'm just saying we can't really prove that he did do it. It's something like that. That's sophistry. That's what we mean when we talk about sophistry. And to that end, I want to give you an example of one of the few surviving speeches in full, a literary piece, a short literary piece by Gorgias of Leontini, called The Defense of Helen, because it is a perfect example, really, of just this idea of trying to show that a guilty person is in fact innocent, to not aim at what actually happened, to not try to get at the truth by means of discursive reasoning and exact language, but rather to try to obfuscate by language, to try to throw dust in the eyes of the audience, and to try to aim at what is possible and make the weaker argument appear the stronger. The speech that we're going to read right now is called The Defense of Helen. And it is a mythological subject matter. It is about Helen of Troy. Now, as we all know, the story goes that originally there was a marriage between the goddess Thetis and the mortal man Peleus, and that Peleus and Thetis at their marriage invited all of the gods except for one, the goddess Eris, which means strife, because who would want strife at a wedding, right? Now, of course, because she is the goddess Strife, she did not take kindly to this and was quite miffed. And so she decided to get back at the gods for not inviting her by creating a golden apple. And on that apple was inscribed a single word, a superlative adjective in the dative case, Callista, okay, for the most beautiful. And she threw the apple into the wedding, and it landed on the floor between the feet of Hera, Aphrodite, and Athena, the three goddesses. And each of them, of course, because it was for the most beautiful, immediately thought it was for them. And so that there was a dispute, therefore, there was strife at the wedding, just as Eris had planned. And to adjudicate this matter, they decided to essentially have the world's first beauty contest, where they got a hold of the most handsome mortal man, whose name was Paris, a Trojan. And on Mount Ida, they put him there, and the three of them appeared before him and said, judge which one of us is the most beautiful. Now, on the sly, each one of them had separately come to him and offered him a bribe. Hera had come to him and said, I will give you rulership over many cities. He said, nah, I'm not interested in that. Athena had come to him and said, I will give you strength in battle and wisdom. Nah, I'm not interested in that, Paris said. Aphrodite came to him and said, I will make the most beautiful woman in the world fall in love with you. And of course, he said, okay, I'll go with you. So he picked her, and she won the golden apple. The only problem, of course, was that Aphrodite was going to make the most beautiful woman fall in love with him, and that woman happened to be married already. This woman is Helen of Troy. She was originally Helen of Sparta, and she was married to Menelaus, and all of a sudden, Paris shows up as an uninvited guest one day, and Menelaus, being unsuspecting, takes him in, only to wake up the following morning and to find his wife has gone with Paris, has left. And so, you know the story. Hers was the face that launched 1,000 ships. And the Greeks, with Menelaus and especially his brother Agamemnon, they go to Troy and wage war for 10 years to get her back. Now, because of this, Helen is, and even in the Iliad, she is oftentimes talked about in very disparaging terms. She even calls herself very negative things, basically saying that she was so, she said, this kind of, shameless hussy is now responsible for the death of all of these people. All these men and Trojans. She's brought so much misery upon the Trojans and upon the Greeks too. So many people have died. And all throughout Greek literature, basically, Helen is vilified as the worst possible person that you could ever imagine. Okay, she was kind of universally hated. This appears in Greek tragedy. It appears everywhere. And so what does our sophist Gorgias try to do? He's going to write a defense speech of Helen. And he's going to try to say that it wasn't really her fault, that she was innocent. Okay, he's going to turn everything on its head. He's going to make the weaker argument appear the stronger, shooting for just what is a possible interpretation. Not that she, not that I'm not going to argue about facts, because you never lie on facts. Facts can be found out. Facts can be documented. You lie on motives. Okay, you lie on things that can't be documented, that can never be shown to be one way or another. Now we're going to read this together, this speech, and you'll see the translation of it is a good one, and it tries to capture as much as possible the very, very ornate and rhyming, sometimes even metrical prose of Gorgias. It's whose writing style is very, very complicated, and he likes puns, and he likes plays on words, and it has an almost kind of like poetic quality to it. So I'll try to bring the translation tries to bring that out as much as possible. It puts the Greek words in the parentheses, and I'll try to elaborate on that if I can. Okay, let's read. The adornment, cosmos, of a city is manpower, of a body, beauty, of a soul, wisdom, of an action, virtue, of a speech, truth. And the opposites of these make for disarray, akosmia. Man and woman, and speech and deed, and city and object should be honored, if praiseworthy, with praise, and incur, if unworthy, blame. For it is an error, equal and mistake, to blame the praisable and to praise the blamable. It is the part of one and the same man, both to speak the needful rightly, and to refute what is said not rightly. It is fitting, then, to refute those who rebuke Helen, a woman about whom univocal and unanimous has been the testimony of inspired poets, as has the ill omen of her name, which has become a memorial of misfortunes. For my part, by introducing some reasoning into my speech, I wish to free the accused from blame, and by revealing her detractors as liars and showing forth the truth, to free her from ignorance. So then, that in nature and in ancestry, the woman who is subject of this speech is preeminent among preeminent men and women, is not unclear, even to a few. For it is clear that her mother was Leda, and her father was in fact a god, Zeus, but said to be a mortal, Tyndareus, of whom the one was shown to be her father, because he was, and the latter was disproved because he was said to be. And the latter was the most powerful of men, while the former was lord of all things. Born of such stock, she had godlike beauty, which taking and not mistaking, she kept. In many did she work much desire for her love, and with her one body she brought together the many bodies of men, thinking great thoughts for great goals, of whom some had greatness of wealth, some the glory of ancient nobility, some the vigor of personal agility, some command of acquired knowledge, and all came because of a passion which loved to conquer, and a love of honor which was unconquered. He's referring to the suitors that came to marry her, of whom Menelaus was the winner. Who it was and why and how she sailed away, taking Helen as his love, I shall not say. To tell the knowing what they know already shows the right, but brings no delight. Having passed over the time, then, in my speech now, I shall go on to the beginning of my future speech, and I shall set forth the causes which made it likely that Helen's voyage to Troy should take place. And now he's going to pull out all of his sophistic arguments now. For it was either by the will of fate and the wishes of the gods and the votes of necessity that she did what she did, or by force reduced, or by words seduced, or by love possessed. In other words, again, aiming for what might have been, motive, not fact, only arguing on the plausibility of motive. Now, if through the first, it is right for the responsible to be held responsible, for God's predetermination cannot be hindered by human premeditation. For it is in the nature of things, not for the stronger to be hindered by the weaker, but for the weaker to be ruled and drawn by the stronger, and for the stronger to lead and the weaker to follow. God is a stronger force than man, in might and in wit and in other ways. If then on fate and on God one must place blame, Helen from disgrace one must free. But if it was she was by violence raped and lawlessly forced and unjustly outraged, it is plain that the rapist as the outrager did the wronging, and the raped as the outraged did the suffering. It is right then for the barbarian, that would be Paris, who undertook a barbaric undertaking in word and law and deed, to meet with blame in word, exclusion in law, and punishment in deed. And how would it not be reasonable for a woman raped and robbed of her country and deprived of her friends to be pitied rather than pilloried? He did the dread deeds, she suffered them. It is just, therefore, to pity her, but to hate him. So that's one argument. But now he gives another argument. If that one didn't work, what about this one? But if it was speech which persuaded her and deceived her soul, not even to this is it difficult to make an answer and to banish blame, as follows. Speech is a powerful lord, who with the finest and most invisible body achieves the most divine works. It can stop fear and banish grief, and create joy and nurture pity. I shall show how this is the case, for I must offer proof to the opinions of my hearers. I both deem and define all poetry as speech possessing meter. There comes upon its hearers fearful shuddering and tearful pity and grievous longing, and at the good fortunes and evil actions of others, affairs, and bodies through the agency of words, the soul experiences suffering of its own. But I shall turn from one argument to another. Inspired incantations, conveyed through words, become bearers of pleasure and banishers of pain. For merging with opinion in the soul, the power of the incantation beguiles it and persuades it and alters it by witchcraft. Of witchcraft and magic, twin arts have been discovered, which are errors of the soul and deceptions of opinion. In other words, words can bewitch you, can make you believe something that isn't true. All who have and do persuade people of things do so by molding a false argument. There is a little irony there, isn't it, if you think about what he's doing right now? For if all men on all subjects had both memory of things past and awareness of things present and foreknowledge of the future, speech would be similarly similar. Speech would not be similarly similar, since as things are now, it is not easy for them to recall the past, nor to consider the present, nor to divine the future. So that on most subjects, most men take opinion as counselor to their soul. But opinion being slippery and insecure, casts those employing it into slippery and insecure successes. What cause then prevents the conclusion that Helen similarly, against her will, might have come under the influence of speech, just as if ravished by the force of pirates? For the mode of persuasion is in no way like that of necessity. In other words, not just like being carried away, but its power is the same. For the speech which persuades the soul constrains that soul which it persuades, both to obey its utterances and to approve its doings. The persuader as constrainer does the wrong, and the persuaded as constrained is wrongly blamed. That persuasion, when added to speech, can impress the soul as it wishes, one may learn first from the utterances of the astronomers, by which he means what we would call astrologers, who, substituting opinion for opinion, taking away one but creating another, make what is incredible and unclear seem true to the eyes of opinion. And second, compelling contests in words, in which a single speech written with art but not spoken with truth, may charm and persuade a large multitude. And third, the struggles of philosophic arguments, in which swiftness of thought is also shown, making belief in an opinion easily changed. The effect of speech upon the structure of soul is as the structure of drugs over the nature of bodies. For just as different drugs dispel different secretions from the body, and some bring an end to disease and others to life, so also in the case of speeches, some distress, others delight. Some cause fear, others embolden their hearers, and some drug and bewitch the soul with a kind of evil persuasion. It has been stated then that if she was persuaded by speech, she did not do wrong, but was unfortunate. The fourth cause I shall discuss in a fourth section. For if it was love which did these things, no difficulty will she have in escaping the charge of the sin which is alleged to have taken place. For the things we see do not have the nature which we wish them to have, but the nature which each happens to have. Through sight, the soul is impressed even to its core. For example, when enemy bodies fit themselves out against enemies with warlike gear of bronze and iron, for some for defense, some for offense, if the sight sees this, it is alarmed and alarms the soul, so that often men flee in terror from future danger as if it were present. For strong as is the habit of obedience to the law, it is driven out by fear resulting from sight, which coming to a man causes him to set at naught both the noble that is adjudged through law and the good that comes about through victory. It has happened that people, having seen frightening sights, have lost presence of mind for the present moment. Even thus does fear extinguish and expel thought. And many have fallen victim to useless labor and dread diseases and madness hard to cure. In this way, the sight engraves upon the mind images of things seen, and many frightening impressions linger, and what lingers is very similar to what is said. Moreover, whenever pictures from many colors and figures perfectly create a single figure and form, they delight the sight, while the crafting of statues and the production of artworks provide a pleasant vision to the eyes. So it is natural for the sight to be grieved by some things and to long for others. And much love and desire for many things and bodies is wrought in many people. If, therefore, the eye of Helen, pleased by the body of Alexander, presented to her soul eager desire and contest of love, what is wonderful in that? You see, if it was the god Aphrodite who's kind of inspiring love, then how can she be to blame? If, being a god, love has the divine power of the gods, how could a lesser being reject and refuse it? You see, of course, love here, the word in Greek would be eros, and eros is like the Latin version of Cupid. It's the little naked baby shooting people with arrows. But if it is a disease of human origin and a blind spot in the soul, it should not be condemned as a sin, but considered a misfortune. For she came, as she did, by the snares of fate, not by the counsels of reason, and by the constraints of love, not by the devices of art. How then can one regard the blame of Helen as just, seeing as whether she did what she did by love o'ermastered, or by speech persuaded, or by force ravished, or by divine constraint compelled, she is utterly acquitted of all charge. I have, through speech, removed ill fame from a woman. I have stayed true to the procedure that I set up at the outset of my speech. Now listen to what he says here, because he insults all of us right now. I have tried to end the injustice of blame and the ignorance of opinion. My purpose was to compose a speech as an encomium of Helen and an amusement to myself. And when I say that he has insulted us, what I mean is he tells us in the last line, don't take this seriously. I'm just messing with you. Now, this is interesting because obviously this is a tour de force of sophistry. He gives you so many arguments that seem convincing. And if one of them doesn't work, well, then there's other ones that maybe would work for you. And the key part to understand is that he has absolutely no regard for anything like truth. It's all just a big joke to him, as he says at the very end. I have done this for an amusement for myself. Now, remember this is pure sophistry. This is really what we need to keep in mind, because what I'd like us to do now is to turn our attention away from the teachers themselves, the sophists themselves, and I want to take a look at a couple of writers who we know studied under these sophists, and we can see the effects of that education in their writing. The first of these authors that I would like to take a look at is Herodotus, who lived and wrote during the 5th century of Athens, where he himself was not actually from Athens. He was from a place called Halicarnassus, which is in modern-day Turkey, in southwestern Turkey. It was the ancient city of Halicarnassus, the modern city of Bodrum. It is a place where it was kind of at a cross-section of different cultures from the east and west, even from the south, from Egypt. And Herodotus was clearly a very, very intelligent man, very cultured person. He traveled all around. We know this because he talks about it. He went to Egypt, actually, and he wrote a history of the Persian Wars, in which he went around and actually interviewed people that had fought in the battles, and he drew upon a lot of personal research. That is not to say that he is entirely scientific in the modern sense. He does put in a lot of stuff that we would, I think, not find to our agreement. He, for instance, basically says that the Persians were sort of destined to lose because of the hubris of their king Xerxes, who, when he crossed over the Hellespont, whipped the river with chains and tried to subdue it to his will, because there was a storm and it was not behaving itself, and all sorts of other occasions. And also he has a firm belief in what he calls the phronos theon, the jealousy of the gods, that when a person gets too rich and prosperous for their own good, watch out, because something bad is going to happen around the corner. So he definitely does have some things that are clearly, not in keeping with modern day methods, but nevertheless, he does make an honest attempt to really give a blow-by-blow account and analysis of what took place, okay, in terms of the Persian Wars. The part I want to draw our attention to is his opening prologue, because his whole work is not just about the Persian Wars, but it's envisioned as a sort of history about the clash between East versus West, between the forces of Europe, Greece, and those of Asia, Persia. And because the Greeks looked at their mythology as in some ways being historically true, he begins with historical accounts. But what we see, though, in his accounts that he takes as being historical, but are indeed taken from mythology, he shows a clear influence of the sophists, because just like Protagoras, who tried to demythologize mythology, right, and said that the gods were really just human beings kind of giving the name of God to certain, or the kind of personifying as deities certain physical things that were useful and beneficial, like wine or bread or water. So Herodotus demythologizes the mythology of ancient Greece to begin to look for the first instances of conflict between East and West. Let's take a look at his introductory section right now. This is from the first words of his book 1 of his histories. These are the researches. The word historiae in Greek actually means inquiries or researches. These are these researches of Herodotus of Halicarnassus, which he publishes in the hope of thereby preserving from decay the remembrance of what men have done, and of preventing the great and wonderful actions of the Greeks and the barbarians, by which he means the Persians, from losing their due meed of glory, and withal to put on record what were their grounds of feuds. So that's the purpose, to give kind of an everlasting monument to both the great deeds of Greece and the Persians. According to the Persians, best informed in history, the Phoenicians began to quarrel. This people, who had formerly dwelt on the shores of the Erythraean Sea, by which he means the Red Sea, having migrated to the Mediterranean and settled in the parts which they now inhabit, began at once, they say, to adventure on long voyages, freighting their vessels with the wares of Egypt and Assyria. They landed at many places on the coast, and among the rest at Argos, which was then preeminent above all the states included now under the common name of Hellas, Greece. Here they exposed their merchandise and traded with the natives, those would be the Greeks, for 5 or 6 days. At the end of which time, when almost everything was sold, there came down to the beach a number of women, and among them the daughter of the king, who was, they say, agreeing in this with the Greeks, Io, the child of Inachus. The women were standing by the stern of the ship, intent upon their purchases, when the Phoenicians, with a general shout, rushed upon them. The greater part made their escape, but some were seized and carried off. Io herself was among the captives. The Phoenicians put the women on board their vessel and set sail for Egypt. Thus did Io pass into Egypt, according to the Persian story, which differs widely from the Phoenician, and thus commenced, according to their authors, the series of outrages. So, if you didn't know the story of Io, the myth of Io, you would think that this is just perfectly normal history. What you would miss, though, is the fact that the myth of Io is that Zeus turned himself into a bull and carried Io away, and that is why she was absconded. That's why she was taken away. It wasn't. What Herodotus has done here is he has removed the mythological elements. He has removed Zeus from the whole story and just made it into a story of kind of kidnapping or something like that, that these Easterners did to the Greeks. And he goes on with the same sort of thing. At a later period, certain Greeks, with whose name they are unacquainted, but who would probably be Cretans, made a landing at Tyre, this is modern-day Lebanon, on the Phoenician coast, and bore off the king's daughter, Europe. In this, they only retaliated. Now, this is another story. This is the story where Zeus turns himself into a bull and carries off the woman named Europe, and that is over into Greece, and that is why the continent of Europe, that's where it gets its name. In fact, outside of the headquarters of the European Union, there is a bull with a female sitting on top of it. This may, in fact, be a reference to this myth. I think that is what they say it is, or it could be the harlot on the beast described in the book of Revelation. But whatever the case of that may be, the point is that this myth is another example of a demythologized myth. It is a myth of Zeus. Zeus has been left out of this totally. There's no mention of the bull whatsoever. In fact, the name of the waterway that separates Europe from Asia is known as the Bosphorus, which is a Greek word, bos meaning cow, and phoros meaning a carrying. So the carrying of the cow or the ox of Europe over into Europe. Okay, and now we have another one too. So after this, they say, the Greeks were guilty of a second violence. They manned a ship of war and sailed to Aya, a city of Colchis, which is modern-day Georgia, on the river Phasis, from whence, after dispatching the rest of the business on which they had come, they carried off Medea, the daughter of the king of the land. The monarch sent a herald into Greece to demand reparation of the wrong and the restitution of his child. But the Greeks made answer that having received no reparation for the wrong done them in the seizure of Io, the Argive, the Greek, they should give none in this instance. So now what has Herodotus done again? He's just retold the story of Jason and the Argonauts. Okay, so Jason is one of those classic sort of, Jungian archetypal myths where Jason is a young prince and his wicked uncle has taken over the throne that is rightfully Jason's, and he tells Jason that he must go and get the golden fleece, this special fleece that is made out of gold, a ram skin that is made out of gold, and is being held by this terrible king up in Colchis. And Aedes is the name of the king who's holding it, and he puts together a whole boatload of heroes aboard the Argo. They are all called Argonauts, so this is the story of Jason and the Argonauts, and they go up to Colchis, and there the king Aedes says, okay, you want the golden fleece? Well, you have to do this. You have to yoke together a pair of fire-breathing bulls, then plow a certain field of Mars with dragon's teeth, and then from those teeth will spring up armed men that you must fight and kill. And after that, if you can do all that in a single day, I will give you the golden fleece. Now, of course, he can't do this alone, but it just so happens to be that Aedes has a beautiful daughter named Medea. Okay, and that's who this is referring to. And so Medea helps Jason by putting all this ointment all over him that protects him from the fire-breathing bulls. She explains how to get around the earthborn men, and they finally steal the golden fleece from a serpent, and Jason promises to marry her. So he carries her back to Greece. And then we get back to the land that where his wicked uncle was. Medea convinces the daughters of the wicked uncle to cut the wicked uncle into pieces and put him into a pot of boiling water, under the pretense that if they do this, he will come out a young man again. And she proves this. Medea is a witch, you see. She proves this by having a big pot of boiling potions and stuff like that, and chops up an old goat and puts him inside the pot, and out jumps a spring lamb. So the daughters do this to their father very naively, gullibly, and of course, there are no potions in that pot, and so the man dies. Anyway, that's the story. You can see it's a legend, a myth filled with all sorts of fantastical elements, and yet Herodotus has stripped it down of all of its mythological accoutrements and given us only what seems to him to be kind of the rationalistic history behind it. This is totally in harmony with what the Sophists would have taught him, people like Protagoras and like Protagoras, who had no real beliefs in the gods at all, but yet, look to their legends as having some kind of historical truth behind them. Okay. And it goes on. We don't have to read the rest of it, but there's more of the same kind of, woman stealing. Again, Herodotus is mentioning all of this because he wants to show that these were the original kind of first causes of friction between East and West. Now, Herodotus is to be contrasted in terms of his historical writings with the next and greater historian who comes after him, named Thucydides, one of the greatest writers from the ancient Greek world, one of the greatest writers of all time. And it's certainly, I can't recommend highly enough his work, which is simply called the Histories. It is a work documenting the Peloponnesian War, that is the war between Athens and Sparta, that ripped the entire Greek world apart between the years 431 to 404 BC. So a 27-year-long war in which Thucydides actually fought. He was an admiral for Athens, and he did such a bad job of his at his battle that when he came home, they did one of those euthune things, those scrutinies, and he was actually sent into exile. So he spent the rest of his time romping around Greece, looking at documents and going over to Sparta and talking with them and writing his account of the war. It is an absolutely fantastic read, and it is filled with all sorts of penetrating insights into human nature. And it has had a very, very active afterlife throughout European literature and intellectual history. Many writers, many great writers, have looked to it for inspiration. Very famous people, Machiavelli, Thomas Jefferson, you name it. People, very great minds of throughout European history, have looked to Thucydides for inspiration and insight. Well, we know for a fact that he studied under the Sophists. And one of the interesting ways in which this education of his manifests itself inside of his writings is the fact that he always has these pairs of speeches throughout all of his throughout the whole histories. He generally likes to have two speeches. Sometimes he'll have more. Sometimes he'll have less. Sometimes there'll be a single speech. Sometimes there'll be three, rarely those. Most of the time, though, it's usually pairs of speeches where one person will give their opinion about a certain issue, and then another person will present the opposing point of view. And in this, of course, he makes a point in his first book of saying, I was trying to reproduce what was actually said on these occasions. But then in that same statement, he complicates it immediately afterwards by saying, and when I couldn't find out what exactly was said, I wrote what I think should have been said, which is, of course, another way of saying he just made it up. So, what he's doing basically is manifesting the sophistic training that he received in being able to argue for both sides of a case, okay, on one side or the other. And there's so much that one could look at to analyze the sophistic influence in his writings, but I'm just going to take a look at one section that comes in book 5. And I mentioned it earlier tonight. It is called the Melian Dialogue. It is the part in the war where Sparta and Athens have been fighting for a long time, and Athens decides they're very flush with their own victories. They think that things are going to go well for them, and they're getting ready for even more conquests over in the west in the island of Sicily. And there is one little island that was a colony of Sparta. The Spartans are also known as the Lacedaemonians. And they decide, even though this little island, Milos, has not done anything wrong to Athens, and has remained neutral throughout the war, they decide nevertheless that they want to go in there and basically kill all the men and enslave the women and children just because they can, okay, and take the place over. But before they do, they come there, and the Melians sent out a little embassy to go and speak to the Athenians. And Thucydides gives a kind of rendition of what their conversation was like. It is known as the Melian dialogue. And it is clearly, I think, not meant to be taken in any kind of strict sense. It probably does reflect something of what was said in the arguments, but more than anything, and we know for a fact it can't be any real rendition of what was said, because he doesn't even ascribe speakers' names. He just to the individual speakers. He just says the Athenians say, and then the Melians say. So surely they were not all speaking as one in a kind of chorus. I think what he's meant to do is really just kind of reflect the spirit of what was going on here in Athens at this time. That Athens is clearly, you've now got a whole generation of young people who had been raised and educated in the sophistic kind of moral relativistic worldview, atheistic moral relativism that the Sophists taught. And now they had become the dominant generation. They had become the generation of politicians, of generals, and so on. And so when that sort of mentality takes full bloom, this is what you get. You get empire, you get genocide, you get enslavement. And let's take a look at some of the things, because a lot of the themes that we've been talking about tonight are all visible. I'm just going to give you excerpts from it because it's very long. Let's start right here. The Athenians next made an expedition against the island of Milos with 30 ships of their own, 6 Chian and 2 Lesbian. Chios and Lesbos are 2 islands in the eastern Aegean. 1,200 hoplites and 300 archers, besides 20 mounted archers of their own, and about 1,500 hoplites furnished by their allies in the island. So this is a big force. The Melians are colonists of the Lacedaemonians, that is the Spartans, who would not submit to Athens like the other islanders. At first they were neutral and took no part. But when the Athenians tried to coerce them by ravaging their lands, they were driven into open hostilities. The generals Cleomedes, the son of Lycomedes, and Tisias, the son of Tisimachus, encamped with the Athenian forces on the island. But before they did the country any harm, they sent envoys to negotiate with the Melians. Instead of bringing these envoys before the people, the Melians desired to explain their errand to the magistrates and to the dominant class. They spoke as follows. So this is the speech now between the ambassadors and the Athenians. Since we are not allowed to speak to the people, lest, forsooth, in truth, a multitude should be deceived by seductive and unanswerable arguments, which they would hear set forth in a single uninterrupted oration, for we are perfectly aware that this is what you mean in bringing us before a select few. You who are sitting here may as well make assurance yet surer. Let us have no set speeches at all, but do you reply to each several statement of which you disapprove, and criticize it at once. Say, first of all, how you like this mode of proceeding. First of all, I want to draw your attention to the fact that the Athenians saying, look, we know you don't want us to use our sophistry on your population. That is why you did not bring us in front of the whole demos, so that they could hear a seductive and unanswerable argument, which we would set forth in a single uninterrupted oration. There's kind of this, that's the Athenians talking about themselves. So clearly there is this acknowledgement, obviously, of the power of sophistry. Now the Melians respond. The Melian representatives answered, the quiet interchange of explanations is a reasonable thing, and we do not object to that. But your warlike movements, which are present not only to our fears, but also to our eyes, seem to belie your words. We see that, although you may reason with us, you mean to be our judges, and that at the end of the discussion, if the justice of our case prevail, and we therefore refuse to yield, we may expect war. If we are convinced by you, slavery. So in other words, the Melians understand that, okay, you're talking about having a dialogue, but there's no real dialogue. If we win our case and we show you how we shouldn't give in, then you're just going to come and invade us, and we're going to have war. And if we convince you that we're not going to, I'm sorry, if we are convinced by your argument, then we're just going to give up and become your slaves. The Athenians say, nay, but if you are only going to argue from fancies about the future, or if you meet with us for any other purpose than that of looking your circumstances in the face and saving your city, we have done. In other words, forget about it. But if this is your intention, we will proceed. Melians. It is an excusable and natural thing that men in our position should neglect no argument and no view which may prevail. But we admit that this conference has met to consider the question of our preservation, and therefore let the argument proceed in the manner which you propose. Well then, the Athenians say, we Athenians will use no fine words. We will not go out of our way to prove at length that we have a right to rule because we overthrew the Persians. We're not going to say that we're the good guys, that we have a right to do what we're doing. Or that we attack you now because we are suffering any injury at your hands. We're not even going to try to say that this is somehow a just war or anything like that. We should not convince you if we did. Nor must you expect to convince us by arguing that, although a colony of the Lacedaemonians, you have taken no part in their expeditions, or that you have never done us any wrong. In other words, you don't even save your breath. You don't have to tell us that you never did anything to us. We know you never did anything to us. But you and we should say what we really think and aim only at what is possible. Look at that. That's that sophistic principle. Aim only at what is possible, at what is probable, not what is factually true. We should only aim at what is possible, for we both alike know that into the discussion of human affairs, the question of justice only enters where there is equal power to enforce it. And now this is the most famous line. And that the powerful do as they will, and the weak suffer what they must. In other words, don't talk about justice. Don't talk about how you're innocent and we're guilty and or whatever, because we know that the only time you can ever talk about justice is when you have equal strength on both sides. Then you could have a seat at the negotiating table. Then, okay, you have force to back up your words. Then we can talk about justice. But up until that point, if you're weak and we're strong, we're going to do what we like, and you're going to deal with it, because that's what else you're going to do. So we have naked imperialists, I would say, brute imperialists. They don't try to cloak their words with any kind of logic or any kind of appeal to what is right. And this is indeed the fruit of moral relativism and of sophistry once it is taken and brought to its furthest logical conclusion. The Melians continue. We know only too well how hard the struggle must be against your power and against fortune, if she does not mean to be impartial. Nevertheless, we do not despair of fortune. In other words, we're not going to give up hope, for we hope to stand as high as you in favor of heaven, because we are righteous, and you against whom we contend are unrighteous. So there's kind of like this appeal to, the gods are on our side because we're good and you guys are bad. And we are satisfied that our deficiency in power will be compensated by the aid of our allies, the Lacedaemonians. The Spartans are going to come and help us. They cannot refuse to help us, if only because we are their kinsmen, and for the sake of their own honor. And therefore our confidence is not so utterly blind as you suppose. Okay, so we've got the gods on our sides and we've got the Spartans. Well, now listen to what the Athenians say. As for the gods, we expect to have quite as much of their favor as you, for we are not doing or claiming anything which goes beyond common opinion about divine or men's desires about human things. Now listen to this. For of the gods we believe, and of men we know, Look at that spirit of kind of, if not outright atheism, then kind of like what Protagoras said, about whether the gods exist or they don't exist. I don't really know, and I'm not really that interested. So it's kind of like that. For of the gods we believe, and of men we know, that by a law of their nature, wherever they can rule, they will. This law was not made by us, and we are not the first who have acted upon it. We did but inherit it, and shall bequeath it to all time. And we know that you and all mankind, if you were as strong as we were, would do as we do. Okay. In other words, we're on top right now. But if the tables were turned and we were weak and you were strong, you wouldn't stop to do the same thing to us. You would kill our men and enslave the rest of us. You would. So and don't bring the gods into this, because look, it's written into the constitution of things, into the fabric of being, that strength always seeks to dominate weakness. Okay. And this is very cold, very calculating. And then they go on to say, and you expect to get help from the Lacedaemonians. Yeah, that's going to happen. Let's read what that says. So much for the gods. We have told you why we expect to stand as high in their opinion as you. And then as to the Lacedaemonians, when you imagine that out of very shame they will assist you, we admire the innocence of your idea, but we do not envy you the folly of it. The Lacedaemonians are exceedingly virtuous among themselves, and according to their national standard of morality. But in respect of their dealings with others, although many things might be said, they can be described in few words. Of all men whom we know, they are the most notorious for identifying what is pleasant with what is honorable, and what is expedient with what is just. But how inconsistent is such a character with your present blind hope of deliverance? So, in other words, the idea is that the Spartans are just going to look out for themselves. There's no point in any of these high-minded ideas of loyalty or something like that. So you have a very cold, very calculating, atheistic / agnostic sort of worldview, moral relativism. It's all, and also this kind of, references to language and stuff like that, aiming at what is probable, of the gods we believe, of men we know. This is all, you can see, very, very symptomatic of sophistic education. Okay. We don't have to go further with Thucydides. You can look at that if you want to. But let's look on the last author for our day today, who we know was very influenced by sophistic education. We know who studied under them, and that is the Greek tragic playwright Euripides, who lived throughout, you can say, the majority of the 5th century, died very late in the 5th century, 406 BC, just slightly before Athens lost the war. And we're going to take a look at his play, The Medea. Okay, it follows long after the whole plot line I just articulated a few moments ago when I was giving you the story of the Golden Fleece. So this is his play, Medea, is about that woman Medea and Jason, but many years later, after he has, and the audience of course would have known the whole backstory. And what so after Jason and Medea run away from her father, she betrays her father. She actually kills her own brother trying to escape. And then when they get to back to Iolcus, which is the area where Jason was with his wicked uncle, she kills the uncle. And basically she is made enemies all over the place, all entirely in service of Jason. Okay, she has put all of her eggs in his basket. And the play of Euripides begins many, many years later, when she's now in middle age, and she already has had multiple children with Jason, and she awakes to find out that Jason is leaving her for a younger woman. Not only that, but this woman is the princess of the land of Corinth, where they happen to be right now. And she is therefore going to be exiled because of this. Not only is he divorcing her, but now she's been sent out, into the cruel world alone with the children. It's a Greek tragedy, obviously, and all Greek tragedy essentially deals with human suffering. That's the very nature of the genre. It explores the human condition through suffering. And Euripides is very interesting. No, I won't say unique in the sense that he always has female characters, which he does, but because all the great Greek tragedies from Aeschylus and Sophocles all have powerful heroines in their plays. Think of Antigone or Clytemnestra or Jocasta from Oedipus. But what makes Euripides unique, really, in the sense, is his very, very overwhelming focus upon not just looking at human suffering, but almost always in every one of his plays, looking at human suffering through the feminine lens. He always tends, just like this is a perfect example of it. There are certain things that people endure universally, certain kinds of suffering, but then there are kinds of sufferings that disproportionately affect women. And being left, abandoned, divorced in middle age with the kids, and then being sent out into exile. That's not something that men really have to deal with. But it is something that women have to deal with. And in fact, and this is very common throughout his other plays, The Trojan Women is all about the female survivors of the Trojan War. It's all the men have been killed, all of their sons and husbands and fathers have been killed. And they are now left to deal with the suffering of being sold off as slaves to their new masters, their captors. Again, this is something that many people throughout history, many women throughout history have had to deal with. And there's many other examples that one can give of that. And in fact, in almost all of his plays, there is some kind of violent separation of mothers from their children. And this is, it's interesting. Many scholars have noted this fact, that Euripides has this kind of focus in his works, and that he understands the plight and the suffering of women in a kind of unique way. And one can only speculate as to why that might have been the case. There is there is a tradition that's found in Aristophanes, who makes fun of everybody in Athens at the time, including Euripides. But he refers to Euripides' own mother as being so poor that she had to sell sausages in the Agora. She's kind of like a hot dog lady or something like that. And that's so there might have been something in Euripides' own life. Maybe he was raised by a single mother. One, of course, can't really ever know for sure, but the effect on his writing, though, is obvious. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to read the set of speeches that takes place when now Jason comes back to Medea after she has already found out that she's going to be dumped, and that he's dumping her for this new princess, much younger girl. And they have a debate. Okay, they have an agon, which is the Greek word for a kind of linguistic struggle, a debate. And these debates appear all throughout Euripides' dramas. They are a standard feature. Sometimes there's going to be multiple ones of them inside of his plays. And they're really, really great because they really clearly show the kind of sophistic influence there, because he's capable of making arguments on both sides of an issue, which of course should now be familiar. But also, the reason why I chose this one as opposed to many others I could have chosen is because Jason is so clearly a sophist. In fact, he even refers to himself at one point in it as kind of a wise person by way of speaking, a clever person. And Medea even refers to him as Sophos when it comes to being cunning. And so clearly, there is some kind of self-consciousness here about the sophistic tradition, some kind of maybe, meta-analysis. And basically what Jason is going to do is he's going to try to convince Medea that he is leaving her for Medea's own good, that this is actually going to be a beneficial thing for her. So that clearly is, I think, making the weaker argument appear the stronger. And he's going to employ a lot of arguments of things that we've already seen, particularly things from Gorgias and from Protagoras. We'll begin here with Jason entering with his attendants. This is not the first occasion that I have noticed how hopeless it is to deal with a stubborn temper. For with reasonable submission to our ruler's will, you might have lived in this land and kept your home. As it is, you are going to be exiled for your loose speaking. Not that I mind myself. You are free to continue telling everyone that Jason is a worthless man. But as to your talk about the king, consider yourself most lucky that exile is your punishment. I, for my part, have always tried to calm down the anger of the king and wished you to remain. But you will not give up your folly, continually speaking ill of him, and so you are going to be banished. All the same, and in spite of your conduct, I'll not desert my friends, but have come to make some provision for you, so that you and the children may not be penniless, or in need of anything in exile. Certainly exile brings many troubles with it, and even if you hate me, I cannot think badly of you. And now Medea. Oh, coward in every way, that is what I call you. With bitterest reproach for your lack of manliness, you, my worst enemy, have come to me. It is not an example of overconfidence or of boldness thus to look your friends in the face, friends you have injured. No, it is the worst of all human diseases, shamelessness. But you did well to come, for I can speak ill of you and lighten my heart, and you will suffer while you are listening. And first I will begin with what happens first. I saved your life, and every Greek who was a shipmate of yours above the Argo knows it. When you were sent to control the bulls that breathed fire and yoke them, and when you would sow that deadly field, and that snake that who encircled it with his many folds the golden fleece and guarded it and never slept, I killed, and so gave you the safety of the light. And I myself betrayed my father and my home, and came with you to Peleus's land of Iolcus. And then, showing more willingness to help than wisdom, I killed him, Peleus, with the most dreadful death, at his own daughter's hands, and took away your fear. This is how I behaved to you, you wretched man, and you forsook me, took another bride to bed, though you had children, for if that had not been, you would have had an excuse for another wedding. Faith in your word has gone. Indeed, I cannot tell whether you think the gods whose names you swore by then have ceased to rule, and that new standards are set up. Since you must know that you have broken your word to me. Oh, my right hand, and the knees which you often clasped in supplication. How senselessly I am treated by this bad man, and how my hopes have missed their mark. Come, I will share my thoughts as though you were a friend. Can I think that you would ever treat me well? But I will do it, and these questions will make you appear the baser. Where am I to go? To my father's? Him I betrayed in his land when I came with you. To Peleus's wretched daughters? What a fine welcome they would prepare for me, who murdered their father. For this is my position, hated by my friends at home. I have in kindness to you made enemies of others whom there was no need to have injured. And how happy among Greek women you have made me on your side for all this. A distinguished husband I have for breaking promises. When in misery I am cast out of the land and go into exile, quite without friends and all alone with my children, that will be a fine shame for the new wedded groom, for his children to wander as beggars, and she who saved him. O God, you have given to mortals a sure method of telling the gold that is pure from the counterfeit. Why is there no mark engraved upon men's bodies by which we could know the true ones from the false ones? Now the chorus responds, the chorus made up of women from Corinth. It is a strange form of anger, difficult to cure when two friends turn upon each other in hatred. And now we will listen to Jason's speech, and notice again, pay close attention to his sophistic arguments, making the weaker argument appear the stronger. As for me, it seems I must not be a bad speaker, but like a man who has a good grip of the tiller, reef up his sail, and so run away from under this mouthing tempest, woman, of your bitter tongue. Since you insist on building up your kindnesses to me, my view is that Cyprus, Aphrodite, was alone responsible of men and gods for the preserving of my life. You are clever enough, but really I need not enter into the story of how it was love's inescapable power that compelled you to keep my person safe. On this, I will not go into too much detail. Where does that sound familiar? Right? It wasn't really you who helped me. It was only because Aphrodite made you fall in love with me. So it's really love, Aphrodite, that I credit with being kept safe. that should remind us of Gorgias's argument, right? Helen wasn't really at fault because it was love that made her do what she did. Insofar as you helped me, you did well enough. But on this question of saving me, I can prove you have certainly got from me more than you gave. Firstly, instead of living among barbarians, you inhabit a Greek land and understand our ways, how to live by law instead of the sweet will of force. And all the Greeks considered you a clever woman. You were honored for it, while if you were living at the ends of the earth, nobody would have heard of you. For my part, I, rather than stores of gold in my house or power to sing even sweeter songs than Orpheus, I'd choose the fate that made me a distinguished man. There is my reply to your story of my labors. Remember, it was you who started the argument. I mean, he's not just a sophist, he's a total psychopath and narcissist. Next, for the attack on my wedding with the princess, here I will prove that, first, it was a clever move, secondly, a wise one, and finally, that I made it in your best interest and the children's. Please keep calm. I love that part, because it obviously is an indication that at that point, the actor playing Medea would have to go, "Ah!" Some kind of really uproar, that, he's trying to convince her that he's leaving her for her own benefit. When I arrived here from the land of Iolcus, involved as I was in every kind of difficulty, what luckier chance could I have come across than this, an exile to marry the daughter of the king? It was not the point that seems to upset you, that I grew tired of your bed and felt the need for a new bride. Nor with any wish to outdo your number of children. We have enough already. I am quite content. But this was the main reason, that we might live well and not be short of anything. I know that all a man's friends leave him stone cold if he becomes poor. Also, that I might bring my children up worthily of my position, and by producing more of them to be brothers of yours, we would draw the families together and all be happy. So, in other words, I'm leaving you to have more children with another woman, so that when they grow up, they could be brothers with your sons, and we could all have Thanksgiving together. That's basically what he's saying. Do you think this is a bad plan? You wouldn't if the love question hadn't upset you. But you women have gotten to such a state of mind that if your life at night is good, you think you have everything. But if in that quarter things go wrong, you will consider your best friend and truest interest most hateful. It would have been better for men far to have gotten their children in some other way, and women not to have existed. Then life would have been good. The chorus then says, Jason, though you have made this speech of yours look well, still I think, even though others do not agree, you have betrayed your wife and are acting badly. Again, that's the whole sophistic enterprise, isn't it? To make the weaker argument appear the stronger. You have said this well, but I think you're still doing something wrong. Now, Medea, because she's such a good speaker, so genuinely intelligent, she sees through this immediately and shoots him down. Let's listen to what she says. Medea, surely in many ways I hold different views from others, for I think that the plausible speaker who is a villain deserves the greatest punishment. She is just defined a sophist. Confident in his tongue's power to adorn evil, he stops at nothing, yet he is not really wise. You see that in Greek there's this pun on the word sophos and sophistes. You see, that is a perfect definition of what a sophist is, though. The plausible speaker who is a villain, who is confident in his tongue's power to adorn evil, yet he is not really wise. In your case, there is no need to put on airs of a clever speaker, for one word will lay you flat. If you were not a coward, you would have not married behind my back, but disgusted with me first. In other words, if he really was telling the truth, and if he really was doing this for her betterment, he would have not done it in secret. He would have told her about it first. And that is a knockout argument. That is a smackdown argument. And Jason says, and you no doubt would have furthered the proposal if I had told you of it, you who even now are incapable of controlling your bitter temper. That's a pretty good comeback. Okay, there's some logic to that. It was not that. No, you thought it was not respectable as you got on in years to have a foreign wife. Jason, make sure of this. It was not because of a woman I made the royal alliance in which I now live. But, as I said before, I wish to preserve you and breed a royal progeny to be brothers, to be the children I have now, a sure defense. Now, remember what I told you before. A sophist knows you don't lie on facts, you lie on motive, okay? Because motives can never be found out. And so that's exactly what Jason is doing now, okay? I'm not saying that I didn't leave you for another woman. I'm saying I did it for this motive, which is honorable. Medea, let me have no happy fortune that brings pain with it, or prosperity which is upsetting to the mind. Jason, change your ideas of what you want and show more sense. Do not consider painful what is good for you, nor, when you are lucky, think yourself unfortunate. Medea, you can insult me. You have somewhere to turn to, but I shall go from this land into exile, friendless. Jason, it was what you chose for yourself. Don't blame others for it. Medea, and how did I choose it? Did I betray my husband? You called down wicked curses on the king's family. A curse, that is what I have become to your house, too, Jason. I do not propose to go into all the rest of it, but if you wish for the children or for yourself in exile to have some of my money to help you, say so, for I am prepared to give it with open hand, or to provide you with introductions to my friends who will treat you well. You are a fool if you do not accept this. Cease your anger, and you will profit. Medea, I shall never accept the favors of friends of yours, nor take a thing from you, so you need not offer it. There is no benefit in the gifts of a bad man. Jason, then in any case I call the gods to witness that I wish to help you and the children in every way, but you refuse what is good for you. Obstinately you push away your friends. You are sure to suffer for it. Medea, go. No doubt you hanker for your virginal bride and are guilty of lingering too long out of her house. Enjoy your wedding, but perhaps with the help of God, you will make the kind of wedding, a marriage that you will regret. Now, I won't, well, actually, I will. I will ruin the rest of the play for you because you should read it. It is one of the great masterpieces of literature. But the way that she gets back at Jason in the end is by killing their children. Even though this, of course, makes her suffer, she knows it will make Jason suffer too, blotting out his lineage basically forever. She also kills the princess. So I think you get the idea, my friends. Sophism, sophistry, the words are synonymous. The act of disguising arguments through verbiage, through arguing what is plausible, not what is true, not even really believing that there is such a thing as what is true, all tied up with a morally relativistic worldview, and one that is essentially skeptical of or agnostic, if not outright atheistic. These are the characteristics of sophistry. And now I want to leave, because this is a class in the history of ancient education. I want you to keep that in mind, and I want you to think about for yourselves, what is the effect that this sort of education will have on young minds? The answer to that, at least Thucydides' answer to that, I think can be clearly seen in his dialogue on the Melian dialogue. That is, that sort of mentality, that there is no fixed, true, moral absolute, will ultimately give birth to deeds. As Aristotle will say, life is the activation of thought. Life is the activation of thought. What we truly believe about metaphysics, theology, morality, this ultimately will affect the way we live and the way we act. And that, of course, is the whole point of education, to be a speaker of words and a doer of deeds, as the ancient Greeks would say. All right, friends, thank you very much, and I will see you next time.